The Landmark Thucydides, A Comprehensive Guide to the Peloponnesian War, by Thucydides, edited by Robert B. Strassler. Introduction. Imagine an army of 40,000 men, the pride of a great empire, now a broken and starving mob. They are deep in enemy territory, their ships destroyed, their escape route cut off. For days, they have been marching, relentlessly harassed by enemy horsemen and javelin throwers. They are exhausted, wounded, and dying of thirst. They finally see a river. In that moment, all discipline breaks. The men, desperate for just a sip of water, stampede into the river, trampling one another, pushing each other under the muddy water. As they drink, their enemies stand on the steep banks above them, picking them off with arrows and javelins. The river runs red with blood, the water thick with the bodies of the dead and dying. The men keep drinking. This was the end of the great Athenian expedition to Sicily. It was the most catastrophic military defeat in the history of ancient Greece. And one man, an Athenian general who had been exiled years earlier, watched it all unfold and decided to write down the story for all time. His name was Thucydides. Today, we journey into his masterpiece, the Peloponnesian War. And thanks to a modern edition by Robert B. Strassler called The Landmark Thucydides, this incredible story, written over 2,400 years ago, is more accessible than ever. This isn't just a dry history of battles and dates. This is a story about human nature itself. It's a story about how fear can drive nations to war, how ambition can lead the most brilliant societies to ruin, and how, in the crucible of conflict, words become weapons and morality becomes a luxury. By the end of this journey, you will understand not just how a 27-year war destroyed the golden age of Greece, but you will also gain a profound insight into the timeless patterns of politics, power, and conflict that shape our world today. Because Thucydides wrote his history, as he said, not as an essay to win the applause of the moment, but as a possession for all time. Let's uncover why. Book summary. Our story is a tale of two cities, two superpowers of the ancient Greek world, as different as night and day. On one side, you have Sparta. Imagine a nation that is nothing but a military barracks. From the age of 7, every male citizen was taken from his family and put through a brutal, lifelong training regimen designed to create the most disciplined and feared soldiers on earth. The Spartans were conservative, slow-moving, suspicious of new ideas, and utterly dominant on land. Their entire society was built on the backs of a vast enslaved population known as the Helots, who they terrorized and controlled through sheer force. Sparta was an oligarchy, ruled by a few, and its main goal was to maintain the status quo and keep its world in order. On the other side, you have Athens. Athens was the opposite. It was a democracy, a bustling hub of innovation, art, philosophy, and trade. The Athenians were curious, fast-moving, and brilliant. They were a sea power. Their navy was the most powerful in the world, and they used it to build an empire of allied and subject city-states all across the Aegean Sea. This empire brought them immense wealth, which they used to fund their radical democracy, build magnificent temples like the Parthenon, and create a culture that is still the foundation of Western civilization. For decades, these two powers circled each other, their systems and their ambitions fundamentally at odds. Sparta, the Stoic land power, looked at the fast-growing, dynamic Athenian empire with deep suspicion. Athens, for its part, saw Sparta as a backwards, repressive force holding back progress. Thucydides tells us that while there were immediate sparks that lit the fire of war, disputes over smaller cities like Corcyra and Potidaea, the real cause, the one that made the conflict inevitable, was much deeper. It was, in his words, the growth of the power of Athens, and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta. It's a pattern we see again and again in history. A rising power challenges an established power, and the established power feels it must fight to maintain its position. The war that followed would last for 27 years and tear the Greek world apart. When the war finally began in 431 BC, each side had a clear strategy. The Spartans, led by their cautious king, Archidamus, planned to do what they did best: marched their unstoppable army into Athenian territory, a land called Attica, and burned the crops and countryside. They believed that the Athenians, a proud people of farmers and landowners, would not be able to stand by and watch their homes be destroyed. They would be forced to come out and fight a decisive land battle, a battle the Spartans knew they would win. But the leader of Athens, a brilliant statesman named Pericles, had a radical and unexpected plan. He told the Athenians to do the unthinkable: abandon their land. He convinced the entire population of Attica to retreat inside the massive stone walls that connected the city of Athens to its port, the Piraeus. These were the famous Long Walls. Pericles' strategy was to turn Athens into an island. Let the Spartans burn the countryside, he argued. It doesn't matter. As long as Athens controls the sea, its navy can import all the food and supplies it needs from its vast empire. Meanwhile, that same navy would become their sword. They would use their ships to raid the coasts of the Peloponnesus, Sparta's homeland, hitting the enemy where they were weakest and bleeding them dry. Athens would not risk a land battle. They would outlast the Spartans, wearing them down until they were forced to accept a peace that recognized Athenian power. It was a brilliant, defensive strategy, a war of attrition. And in the first year, it seemed to work. The Spartans invaded, the Athenians huddled behind their walls, and the navy set sail. The Athenians were frustrated watching their lands burn, but they held their discipline and trusted Pericles. But then, something happened that no one, not even the wise Pericles, could have foreseen. In the second year of the war, a disease broke out within the crowded city walls: the plague of Athens. Thucydides, who caught the plague himself and survived, gives us a chilling, clinical account of its horrors. It began with fevers and inflammation of the eyes, followed by a bloody throat and a harsh cough. It then moved to the stomach, causing violent retching. The body broke out in pustules and ulcers, but burned with such an internal fever that patients couldn't bear the slightest touch of clothing, and many threw themselves into wells, desperate for cold water. The plague was devastating. It killed over a quarter of the population, but its impact went far beyond the loss of life. Thucydides shows us how the plague broke down the very fabric of Athenian society. In the face of random, horrific death, laws and religious traditions lost their meaning. Men, seeing both the righteous and the wicked dying alike, stopped fearing the gods. They began to spend their money wildly, seeking only the pleasure of the moment, believing that both life and wealth were things of a day. The social order that had made Athens great began to crumble. And among the dead was Pericles himself. His loss was the greatest blow of all. Thucydides argues that with Pericles gone, Athens was left in the hands of lesser men, demagogues who sought to lead the people by appealing to their worst instincts, their anger, their fear, and their greed. One such man was Cleon. A tanner by trade, Cleon was a powerful, aggressive, and brutal speaker. He represented a new kind of politician, one who rose to power not through aristocratic birth or military glory, but by commanding the passions of the democratic assembly. Where Pericles had led the people by guiding them with wisdom, Cleon led by following their angriest impulses. The war continued, a grim cycle of Spartan invasions and Athenian naval raids. But the character of the war was changing. It was becoming more brutal, more total. The old rules of hoplite warfare, which had limited the scale of conflict, were abandoned. This new kind of war was about annihilation. A few years into the war, a series of events unfolded that would shatter Spartan prestige and change the psychological balance of the entire conflict. An Athenian fleet, led by a brilliant and daring general named Demosthenes, was blown off course by a storm and landed at a place called Pylos, on the coast of Sparta's own territory. On a whim, the soldiers decided to build a fort there. The Spartans were initially dismissive, but they soon realized the danger. An Athenian fort deep in their territory was a beacon for their enslaved Helot population to revolt. They sent an army and a fleet to destroy it. To prevent the Athenians from landing reinforcements, the Spartans put a force of 420 of their elite hoplites on the nearby island of Sphacteria, planning to block the harbor entrances. What happened next was stunning. The Athenian fleet returned, smashed the Spartan ships in the harbor, and trapped the elite Spartan force on the island. The hunters had become the hunted. For Sparta, this was an unprecedented crisis. Spartans did not surrender. They fought to the death. The idea of hundreds of their best soldiers being captured was unthinkable. Back in Athens, the news was met with jubilation. The assembly, spurred on by Cleon, refused Sparta's desperate offers of peace. Cleon, ever the populist, mocked the generals for their caution and boasted that if he were in command, he would sail to Pylos and capture the Spartans in 20 days. In a masterful political maneuver, the general he was criticizing, a cautious man named Nicias, called his bluff and offered to resign the command in his favor. Cleon, who had no real military experience, was suddenly trapped. The assembly roared with laughter and urged him to go. He had no choice but to accept. Incredibly, Cleon's boast came true. Teaming up with the skilled general Demosthenes, the Athenians launched an assault on the island of Sphacteria. Using light-armed troops with javelins and arrows, they wore down the heavily armored Spartan hoplites, who were unused to this kind of skirmishing warfare. Surrounded, exhausted, and with their commander killed, the remaining 292 Spartans did the unthinkable. They surrendered. The capture of the Spartan soldiers sent a shockwave through the Greek world. The myth of Spartan invincibility was shattered. For Athens, it was a moment of supreme triumph, but it was also a moment of supreme arrogance. They had Sparta at their mercy and could have negotiated a lasting peace. Instead, convinced of their own superiority and urged on by men like Cleon, they decided to press their advantage and grasp for more. The war grew uglier. Thucydides shows us how the conflict was not just between cities, but within them, as democratic and oligarchic factions fought for control. He describes a horrifying civil war in the city of Corcyra, where revolution became so bloody and savage that, as he writes, words had to change their ordinary meanings. Reckless audacity came to be called courage. Prudent hesitation was seen as cowardice. Moderation was a cloak for unmanliness. Revenge became more important than self-preservation. Human nature, Thucydides says, was stripped bare. One of the most powerful and chilling episodes in the entire book is the Melian dialogue. The Athenians sail to the small, neutral island of Melos and demand its surrender. The Melians, who are colonists of Sparta but have taken no part in the war, appeal to justice, to fairness, and to the gods. The Athenians brush their arguments aside. In a raw display of power politics, the Athenian envoys tell the Melians that justice only matters between equals. In the real world, they say, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. They argue that it is in Athens' interest to conquer Melos, because to allow a weak island to remain independent would be a sign of Athenian weakness in the eyes of their other subjects. The Melians refuse to surrender their freedom. They place their hope in the gods and in the chance that the Spartans will come to their aid. The Athenians lay siege to the city, and when it finally falls, they put to death all the grown men, sell the women and children into slavery, and resettle the island with their own colonists. This dialogue is a turning point. It shows an Athens that has completely lost its moral compass, an empire that now rules by fear and brute force alone. The idealism of Pericles' funeral oration is a distant memory. It is at this moment of maximum arrogance and moral decay that Athens makes its fateful decision. Envoys arrive from the city of Egesta in Sicily, asking for Athenian help in a local war against their rival, Silenus. They promise great wealth to fund the expedition. This request ignites the imagination of the Athenian assembly. Sicily was a vast and wealthy island, a new world to conquer. Two men came to represent the two sides of the Athenian soul. The first was Nicias, the cautious, respected, and deeply pious general who had opposed Cleon. He argued passionately against the expedition. He warned the Athenians that they were taking on a war they knew nothing about, against powerful cities, an ocean away from home. They had not yet secured their own empire or truly defeated Sparta. To grasp for a new empire before securing the old one was, in his view, the height of folly. He warned them against the ambition of a man who was pushing for the war more than anyone else. That man was Alcibiades. Alcibiades was young, handsome, brilliant, charismatic, and incredibly reckless. He was a student of Socrates and a member of the highest aristocracy, but he was also a populist who could sway the masses with his daring vision. He dreamed of conquering Sicily, then Carthage, and using the wealth of the West to finally crush Sparta and rule the entire Greek world. He dismissed Nicias's warnings as the fears of an old, tired man. He painted a picture of Sicily as a divided land, ripe for the taking. The assembly, filled with a restless energy and a lust for new conquests, was captivated by Alcibiades. They voted overwhelmingly for the expedition. Nicias, seeing that he could not stop them, tried one last desperate tactic. He decided to frighten them with the sheer scale of the undertaking. He stood before the assembly again and said that if they were going to do this, they couldn't do it by halves. He called for a massive force, at least 100 triremes, 5,000 hoplites, and an unprecedented number of support troops and supplies. He hoped the enormous cost would make them reconsider. But his plan backfired completely. Instead of being deterred, the Athenians became even more enthusiastic. They voted Nicias everything he asked for and more. The desire for the expedition, Thucydides tells us, fell upon them all. As the city prepared for the greatest military expedition it had ever launched, a strange and ominous event occurred. In a single night, the Hermae, stone pillars with the head of the god Hermes, which stood at doorways and crossroads all over Athens, were mutilated. Their faces were disfigured. No one knew who had done it, but a wave of fear and paranoia swept the city. It was seen as a terrible omen, a sign of a conspiracy to overthrow the democracy. Suspicion fell on Alcibiades and his circle of arrogant young friends. His enemies seized the opportunity. They accused him of not only mutilating the Hermae but also of profaning the sacred Eleusinian mysteries, one of the most secret and holy religious rites in Greece. Alcibiades demanded an immediate trial to clear his name before the fleet sailed, knowing the army was on his side. But his enemies, fearing his popularity with the soldiers, persuaded the assembly to postpone the trial. They would let him sail, and then recall him later. The departure of the fleet was the most magnificent spectacle Athens had ever produced. Thucydides describes the scene at the Piraeus harbor as the entire population of the city came down to watch their sons, brothers, and friends depart. There was hope and lamentation. Hope for the glorious conquest they would make, and lamentation for the loved ones they might never see again. The ships themselves were the finest ever built, competing with each other in beauty and speed. After prayers and libations were poured from gold and silver cups, a trumpet sounded, and the fleet sailed out, racing each other as far as the island of Aegina. It was, Thucydides says, more a display of power and wealth for the rest of Greece than an armament against an enemy. The command was shared by 3 generals, the reluctant Nicias, the ambitious Alcibiades, and a tough, experienced soldier named Lamachus. When they arrived in southern Italy, the reality of their situation began to set in. The cities there, which they had hoped would join them, offered little support. And when they finally reached Egesta, the city that had promised them so much wealth, they discovered it was all a fraud. The Egestians had tricked them, borrowing gold and silver from neighboring cities and displaying it as their own to deceive the Athenian envoys. They could provide only 30 talents of silver. The generals were divided on what to do. Nicias, ever cautious, wanted to make a show of force against Selinus and then return home. Alcibiades, needing a victory to justify the expedition, wanted to build alliances with other Sicilian cities before attacking Syracuse, the most powerful city on the island and the ultimate prize. Lamachus argued for an immediate, surprise attack on Syracuse itself, while the city was still unprepared. In the end, Alcibiades' plan won out. But just as they began their diplomatic maneuvers, the state ship Salaminia arrived from Athens. It carried orders for Alcibiades to return home to stand trial for the profanation of the mysteries and the mutilation of the Hermae. With the army now far from Athens, his enemies had made their move. Knowing he would be condemned in the paranoid atmosphere back home, Alcibiades agreed to follow the ship, but then escaped and fled to the Peloponnesus. The most brilliant and dynamic commander of the expedition was gone. He would soon reappear, but this time, as an advisor to Sparta, plotting the destruction of his own city. The command now fell to Nicias. A man who had never believed in the expedition was now solely responsible for its success. He proceeded with extreme caution, spending months in minor operations, giving the Syracusans precious time to prepare for the inevitable assault. When the Athenians finally did lay siege to Syracuse the next spring, their engineering and military skill were still formidable. They quickly gained control of the high ground above the city, a plateau called Epipolae, and began building a massive wall of circumvallation, a double wall designed to completely enclose Syracuse and cut it off from all help. The Syracusans, initially panicked, fought back desperately, building their own counterwalls to try and intersect the Athenian line. The Athenians defeated them in battle and continued their work. Victory seemed within their grasp. The city was on the verge of surrender. Then, everything changed. A single Spartan general, a man named Gylippus, arrived. He had landed in Sicily with only a handful of ships, but he was a man of action and energy. He gathered forces from other Sicilian cities allied with Sparta and marched towards Syracuse. Through a stroke of luck and Athenian carelessness, he managed to enter the city just as the Athenians were about to complete their wall. Gylippus's arrival electrified the Syracusans. He immediately took command, organized their forces, and launched a series of attacks. He began building a new counterwall, and this time, the Athenians could not stop him. His wall reached the outer line of the Athenian fortifications, and the investment of Syracuse was broken. The Athenians, who had been the besiegers, now found themselves in the position of being besieged. They were trapped in their own lines, caught between the city walls and the Spartan-led army on Epipolae. Nicias, whose health was failing, sent a desperate letter back to Athens. He described their dire situation, the strength of the enemy, the sickness in his own camp, and the rotting of their ships. He asked for a massive new army and fleet as reinforcements, or, he said, to be recalled. He also asked to be relieved of his command. The Athenians, in a response that shows either incredible resilience or incredible folly, refused to cut their losses. They refused Nicias's resignation and voted to send him everything he asked for: a second fleet and a second army, nearly as large as the first, under the command of their best remaining general, Demosthenes. Meanwhile, acting on the advice of Alcibiades, the Spartans did something they had never done before. They established a permanent, year-round fort in Attica, at a place called Decele, just 13 miles from Athens. From this fort, they could ravage the Athenian countryside at will and prevent the Athenians from ever working their land or their valuable silver mines. The war at home had just escalated dramatically. When Demosthenes and the Second Athenian fleet arrived at Syracuse, it gave the Athenians a temporary boost of morale. Demosthenes, seeing the desperate situation, knew they had to act quickly and decisively. He immediately launched a bold night attack to recapture the high ground of Epipolae. The attack started well. The Athenians surprised the enemy and broke through their first line of defense. But in the darkness and confusion of the battle, on unfamiliar ground, the attack fell apart. The Athenians were routed, suffering terrible losses as their own allies, Dorians from Argos, sang a paean that sounded just like the enemy's. Many Athenians panicked and ran, some falling to their deaths from the cliffs in the dark. The failure of the night attack was the final blow. The army was devastated by disease and defeat. Demosthenes now argued for an immediate withdrawal. He said they should abandon the siege and sail away while they still could. But Nicias refused. He was paralyzed by fear of the Syracusans, but even more, fear of the Athenian assembly. He knew that if he returned to Athens in defeat, he would be blamed and likely executed. He also clung to a secret hope that a pro-Athenian faction within Syracuse would betray the city, or that the Syracusans would soon run out of money. Just as Nicias finally, reluctantly, agreed to the retreat, another omen appeared. On the night of August 27, 413 BC, there was a total eclipse of the moon. Nicias, a deeply superstitious man, was terrified. His soothsayers told him it was a terrible sign, and that the army must wait for 27 days before making any move. That delay was fatal. The Syracusans, now completely confident, decided to seize the opportunity to destroy the Athenians once and for all. They launched a full-scale attack on the Athenian fleet inside the Great Harbor. In a massive, chaotic battle, the Syracusans, using ships with reinforced prows, smashed the Athenian fleet. The Athenians were defeated, and their commander Eurymedon was killed. Now the Athenians were truly trapped. The Syracusans blocked the mouth of the Great Harbor with a line of ships, sealing them in. The Athenians' only hope was one last, desperate attempt to break out. They manned every ship they had, about 110 in all, and threw all their remaining strength into one final naval battle. The entire army gathered on the shore to watch, their fate hanging on the outcome. Thucydides' description of the battle is one of the most powerful and moving passages in all of literature. He describes the agonizing emotions of the men on shore, screaming encouragement to their friends, groaning in despair as they saw a ship go down, their bodies swaying with the fortunes of the battle as if they were in the ships themselves. In the end, the Athenians were utterly defeated. They were driven back to shore. Their breakout attempt failed. Their spirit was broken. They were so overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster that they didn't even ask for a truce to recover their dead. They just wanted to escape. Nicias and Demosthenes decided their only option was a land retreat, a desperate march across Sicily to a friendly city. But Hermocrates, the Syracusan general, fearing they might escape in the night, used a clever trick. He sent horsemen to the Athenian camp who pretended to be friendly informants, warning Nicias that the roads were guarded and that he should wait. Nicias, tragically, believed them and delayed the retreat by another day. That delay gave the Syracusans time to block every road and ford. When the Athenian army finally marched out, 40,000 strong, it was a scene of utter misery. They had to abandon their sick and wounded, whose cries and pleas, Thucydides says, were more terrible than the sight of the enemy. The dead lay unburied. The retreat was a week-long nightmare. Harassed constantly by Syracusan cavalry, without food, and tormented by thirst, the army staggered on. The force became separated. The division under Demosthenes was surrounded, and, after being worn down by a hail of missiles, was forced to surrender, 6,000 men laying down their arms. Nicias and his division pushed on, until they reached the river Acinarus, and there, the final horror unfolded. The army, maddened by thirst, broke formation and plunged into the river, where they were slaughtered by the Syracusans from the banks above. Finally, Nicias himself surrendered to the Spartan general Gylippus, begging him to stop the massacre. Of the 40,000 who had marched out, only a few escaped. Most were killed or captured. Nicias and Demosthenes were executed by the Syracusans. The thousands of prisoners were sent to the stone quarries of Syracuse, where they were kept in horrific conditions, exposed to the sun by day and the cold by night, with starvation rations of food and water. Most died there. Thucydides concludes the story with a stark judgment. This was the greatest Hellenic achievement of any in this war, or, in my opinion, in Hellenic history, at once most glorious to the victors, and most calamitous to the conquered. They were beaten at all points and altogether. All that they suffered was great. They were destroyed, as the saying is, with a total destruction. Their fleet, their army, everything was destroyed, and few out of many returned home. The disaster in Sicily should have been the end for Athens. But it wasn't. The last part of Thucydides' history, which ends abruptly in the year 411 BC, describes the incredible aftermath. The news of the defeat caused panic and despair in Athens, but they refused to give up. They used their last financial reserves to build a new fleet. But the defeat energized their enemies. Their allies, seeing their weakness, began to revolt. The Spartans, now receiving money and support from the Persian Empire, built up their own fleet to challenge Athens at sea. Alcibiades, having fallen out with the Spartans, fled to the court of the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, and began to play a complex game, trying to engineer his own recall to Athens by promising to bring Persian support with him. This led to a political revolution in Athens itself. A group of oligarchs, known as the 400, overthrew the democracy. But the Athenian fleet, based at the island of Samos, refused to accept the new government and remained loyal to the democracy. Athens was now fighting a war on three fronts: against the Peloponnesians, against its own revolting allies, and against itself. Thucydides' narrative ends here, in the middle of this chaotic period. But the epilogue in the Landmark edition tells us how the story concluded. The Athenian democracy was restored, and Alcibiades was recalled. For a few years, his military genius led Athens to a series of stunning naval victories. It seemed as though Athens might still pull off a miraculous recovery. But in the end, it was not to be. In 405 BC, at a place called Aegospotami in the Hellespont, the Spartan admiral Lysander, funded by the Persian prince Cyrus, caught the Athenian fleet completely by surprise and destroyed it. With its last fleet gone, Athens was helpless. Lysander blockaded the Piraeus, and the city, cut off from its grain supply, was slowly starved into submission. In 404 BC, Athens surrendered. The Peloponnesian War was over. The Spartans tore down the long walls, the symbol of Athenian power, to the sound of flute girls. The golden age of Greece had come to a violent and tragic end. Commentary. What are we to make of this immense, tragic story? Why does this account of a war fought with spears and wooden ships, 2.5 millennia ago, still hold such a powerful grip on our imagination? I believe it's because Thucydides gave us something more than just a history. He gave us a manual on power, a timeless exploration of human nature under pressure. Reading the Peloponnesian War is like watching a doctor perform an autopsy on history itself, laying bare the causes and effects of human conflict with unflinching, scientific precision. One of the most profound lessons is about the nature of power and fear. The war began not because of a single act of aggression, but because of a gradual shift in the balance of power that made Sparta feel insecure. Thucydides teaches us that perception is reality. It was Sparta's fear of what Athens might do that made the war inevitable. It's a dynamic that has played out countless times since, from the Cold War to modern geopolitical rivalries. Nations, like people, often act out of their deepest insecurities. The book is also a powerful warning about the dangers of hubris, of overreaching ambition. The Sicilian expedition is the ultimate cautionary tale. Athens, at the height of its power, blinded by its own success, embarked on a war of conquest it did not need and did not understand. The debate between Nicias and Alcibiades is a timeless dialogue between caution and reckless ambition, between prudence and the seductive dream of glory. Athens chose the dream, and it led to their nightmare. It reminds us that the greatest empires are often brought down not by external enemies, but by their own internal arrogance. And perhaps most powerfully, Thucydides gives us an unsparing look at what war does to us. He shows how it erodes morality, how it corrupts language, and how it reduces complex human decisions to the brutal logic of survival. The journey from Pericles' noble funeral oration, with its celebration of democratic virtues, to the cold, ruthless calculus of the Melian dialogue, is the story of Athens' moral collapse. It teaches us that civilization is a thin veneer, and that under the extreme pressure of war, we are all capable of becoming something we would never have imagined. So, what can we take away from this today? First, a healthy skepticism of political rhetoric. Thucydides shows us, again and again, how leaders use words to mask their true intentions, appealing to justice and freedom while pursuing power and self-interest. We should always look at what people do, not just what they say. Second, a deep appreciation for prudence and caution. The Athenians were brilliant, but their brilliance often tipped over into recklessness. Nicias, for all his flaws, understood the dangers of grasping for too much, too soon. Sometimes, the wisest course of action is to protect what you have, rather than risk it all for an uncertain prize. And finally, a sense of humility. Thucydides shows us the powerful role that chance, luck, and the unexpected, what he calls tyche, play in human affairs. The plague, the storm that drove the fleet to Pylos, the eclipse of the moon, these were all things beyond human control that changed the course of history. It's a reminder that no matter how brilliant our plans, we are never fully in command of our destiny. That was a summary of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. We've journeyed through the main narrative today, but to be perfectly honest with you, a summary is just a map of the territory. The real treasure is found when you walk the ground yourself. It's in the quiet moments, when one of Thucydides' stark observations about human nature, or a particular story of courage or folly, resonates with your own experience in a way you didn't expect. This summary is intended to be a gateway, to help you decide if this monumental work is worth your time. If anything we've discussed today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to grab a copy, especially the Landmark edition with its helpful maps and notes. Reading it isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's an experience that can fundamentally change the way you understand the world and the people in it. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please show your support by liking this summary and subscribing to the Billionaire's Bookshelf. That way, you won't miss our next deep dive into another book that has shaped the minds of leaders and thinkers for centuries. Let's continue to learn and grow together.